Good evening. I hope you enjoyed this short with Zadie Smith. It seemed right for tonight, where elective affinities and matters of taste may come into play. My name is Paul Holden-Graber, and I'm the director of Live from the New York Public Library. As many of you have heard me say before, my goal at the library is simply to make the lions roar, to make a heavy institution dance, and when successful, to make it levitate. Among the upcoming events on November 2nd, you might want to join us when Joel Klein will be in conversation with Salman Khan and Carlos Slim on education. On November 7th, Henry Rollins will be in conversation with Damien Eccles of the West Memphis 3. And on November 12th, I will be speaking with Andrew Solomon, the author of the forthcoming book, Far from the Tree, one of the most extraordinary works I have read in recent and not so recent memory. We end the season with Chris Weir in conversation with Zadie Smith. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome two of the greatest living writers in conversation with each other. I know little of what will happen tonight. I know that Don DeLillo will read for 12 and a half minutes, and Jonathan Franzen will join him afterwards for a conversation, followed possibly by a Q&A, I think, and a book signing, I hope. The rest we leave to chance and pleasure. Don DeLillo is the author of 15 novels, including Underworld, Falling Man, White Noise, and Libra. But rather than reading his biography, as it were, I asked him, as I've asked everyone for the last 4 or 5 years, to give me a biography, a haiku, or if you're very modern, a tweet, in 7 words that might define them. In an interview in Guernica magazine, Don DeLillo spoke about the conditions under which he wrote his first novel in 1964. I lived in a very minimal kind of way. My telephone would be $4.30 every month. I was paying a rent of $60 a month, and I was becoming a writer. So in one sense, I was ignoring the movements of the time. The 7 words that Don DeLillo submitted to me was Bronx boy wondering why he is here. Jonathan Franzen is the author of 4 novels, Freedom, Correction, Strong Motion, and The 27th City. But rather than reading his biography, I asked him to also provide me with 7 words. Until the moment when he arrived here, I would have said that Jonathan Franzen, like Bartleby the Scrivener, preferred not to. But tonight, knowing that Don DeLillo had given me 7 words, and feeling rather ashamed that he hadn't, he gave me his 7 words, different words from Don DeLillo's. I'll read his 7 words. St. Louis, Philadelphia, Berlin, Boston, Queens, Manhattan, Santa Cruz. Enjoy the reading, the conversation, and your questions, and Jonathan Franzen and Don DeLillo's answers. And now Don DeLillo will read. Please welcome Don DeLillo.
I will read from my recent collection of stories, The Angel Esmeralda. The story I will read is Human Moments in World War III, which was published in Esquire 30 years ago, I believe. And it's quite a long story. I will read excerpts from the story. Human Moments in World War III. A note about Valmer. He no longer describes the Earth as a library globe or a map that has come alive, as a cosmic eye staring into deep space. This last was his most ambitious fling at imagery. The war has changed the way he sees the earth. The earth is land and water, the dwelling place of mortal men in elevated dictionary terms. He doesn't see it anymore, storm-spiraled, sea-bright, breathing heat and haze and color, as an occasion for picturesque language, for easeful play or speculation. At 220 kilometers, we see shipwakes and the larger airports, icebergs, lightning bolts, sand dunes. I point out lava flows and cold core eddies. That silver ribbon off the Irish coast, I tell him, is an oil slick. This is my third orbital mission, Vollmer's first. He is an engineering genius, a communications and weapons genius, and maybe other kinds of genius as well. As mission specialist, I'm content to be in charge. The word specialist in the standard usage of Colorado Command refers here to someone who does not specialize. Our spacecraft is designed primarily to gather intelligence. The refinement of the quantum burn technique enables us to make frequent adjustments of orbit without firing rockets every time. We swing out into high, wide trajectories, the whole Earth as our psychic light, to inspect unmanned and possibly hostile satellites. We orbit tightly, snugly, take intimate looks at surface activities in untraveled places. The banning of nuclear weapons has made the world safe for war. I try not to think big thoughts or submit to rambling abstractions, but the urge sometimes comes over me. Earth orbit puts men into philosophical temper. How can we help it? We see the planet complete. We have a privileged vista. In our attempts to be equal to the experience, we tend to meditate importantly on subjects like the human condition. It makes a man feel universal, floating over the continents, seeing the rim of the world, a line as clear as a compass arc, knowing it is just a turning of the bend to Atlantic twilight, to sediment plumes and kelp beds, an island chain glowing in the dusky sea. I tell myself it is only scenery. I want to think of our life here as ordinary, as a housekeeping arrangement, an unlikely but workable setup caused by a housing shortage or spring floods in the valley. Vollmer does the citizen's checklist and goes to his hammock to rest. He is 23 years old, a boy with a longish head and close-cropped hair. He talks about northern Minnesota as he removes the objects in his personal preference kit, placing them on an adjacent Velcro surface for tender inspection. I have a 1901 silver dollar in my personal preference kit, little else of note. Vollmer has graduation pictures, bottle caps, small stones from his backyard. I don't know whether he chose these items himself or whether they were pressed on him by parents who feared that his life in space would be lacking in human moments. Our hammocks are human moments, I suppose, although I don't know whether Colorado Command planned it that way. We eat hot dogs and almond crunch bars and apply lip balm as part of the pre-sleep checklist. We wear slippers at the firing panel. Alma's football jersey is a human moment, outsized, purple and white, of polyester mesh, bearing the number 79, a big man's number, a prime of no particular distinction. It makes him look stoop-shouldered, abnormally long-framed. I still get depressed on Sundays, he says. Do we have Sundays here? No, but they have them there and I still feel them. I always know when it's Sunday. Why do you get depressed? The slowness of Sundays. Something about the glare, the smell of warm grass, the church service, the relatives visiting in nice clothes. The whole day kind of lasts forever. A battle management satellite, unmanned, reports high-energy laser activity in orbital sector Dolores. We take out our laser kits and study them for half an hour. The beaming procedure is complex, and because the panel operates on joint control only, we must rehearse the set of established measures with the utmost care. A note about the Earth. The earth is a preserve of day and night. It contains a sane and balanced variation, a natural waking and sleeping, or so it seems to someone deprived of this tidal effect. This is why Vollmer's remark about Sundays in Minnesota struck me as interesting. He still feels, or claims he feels, or thinks he feels, that inherently earthbound rhythm. To men at this remove, it is as though things exist in their particular physical form in order to reveal the hidden simplicity of some powerful mathematical truth. The earth reveals to us the simple, awesome beauty of day and night. It is there to contain and incorporate these conceptual events. It is not too early in the war to discern nostalgic references to earlier wars. All wars refer back. Ships, planes, entire operations are named after ancient battles, simpler weapons, what we perceive as conflicts of nobler intent. This recon interceptor is called Tomahawk II. When I sit at the firing panel, I look at a photograph of Vollmer's granddad when he was a young man in sagging khakis and a shallow helmet, standing in the bare field, rifle strapped to his shoulder. This is a human moment, and it reminds me that war, among other things, is a form of longing. A note about selective noise. 48 hours ago, I was monitoring data on the mission console when a voice broke in on my report to Colorado Command. The voice was unenhanced, heavy with static. I checked my headset, checked the switches and lights. Seconds later, the command signal resumed, and I heard our flight dynamics officer ask me to switch to the redundant sense frequency. I did this, but it only caused the weak voice to return, a voice that carried with it a strange and unspecifiable poignancy. I seemed somehow to recognize it. I don't mean I know who was speaking. It was the tone I recognized, the touching quality of some half-remembered and tender event, even through the static, the sonic mist. About 10 hours later, Vollmer heard the voice. Then he heard 2 or 3 other voices. They were people speaking, people in conversation. He gestured to me as he listened, pointed to the headset, then raised his shoulders, held his hands apart to indicate surprise and bafflement. In the swarming noise, as he said later, it wasn't easy to get the drift of what people were saying. The static was frequent. The references were somewhat elusive, but Vollmer mentioned how intensely affecting these voices were, even when the signals were at their weakest. One thing he did know, it wasn't selective noise. A quality of purest, sweetest sadness issued from remote space. He wasn't sure, but he thought there was also a background noise integral to the conversation. Laughter, the sound of people laughing. In other transmissions, we've been able to recognize theme music, an announcer's introduction, wisecracks and bursts of applause, commercials for products whose long-lost brand names evoke the golden antiquity of great cities buried in sand and river silt. Somehow, we are picking up signals from radio programs of 40, 50, 60 years ago. Our current task is to collect imagery data on troop deployment. Vollmer surrounds his Hasselblad, engrossed in some micro-adjustment. There is a seaward bulge of stratocumulus, sunglint and littoral drift. I see blooms of plankton and a blue of such Persian richness. It seems an animal rapture, a color change to express some form of intuitive delight. As the surface features unfurl, I list them aloud by name. It is the only game I play in space, reciting the earth names, the nomenclature of contour and structure. Glacial scour, moraine debris, shadow coning at the edge of a multi-ring impact site, a resurgent caldera, a mass of castellated rim rock. Over the sand seas now, parabolic dunes, star dunes, straight dunes with radial crests. The emptier the land, the more luminous and precise the names for its features. Vollmer says the things science does best is name the features of the world. We listen to the old radio shows. Light flares and spreads across the blue-banded edge, sunrise, sunset, the urban grids in shadow. A man and a woman trade well-timed remarks, light, pointed, bantering. There is a sweetness in the tenor voice of the young man singing, a simple vigor that time and distance and random noise have enveloped in eloquence and yearning. Every sound, every lilt of strings had this veneer of age. Vollmer says he remembers these programs, although of course he has never heard them before. What odd happenstance, what flourish or grace of the laws of physics enables us to pick up these signals, traveled voices, chambered and dense. At times they have the detached and surreal quality of oral hallucination, voices in attic rooms, the complaints of dead relatives. But the sound effects are full of urgency and verve. Cars turn dangerous corners. Crisp gunfire fills the night. It is wartime. Wartime for does and grape nuts flakes. Comedians make fun of the way the enemy talks. We hear hysterical mock German, moonshine Japanese. The cities are in light. The listening millions, fed, met comfortably in drowsy rooms, at war, as the night comes softly down. Vollmer says he recalls specific moments, the comic inflections, the announcer's fat man laughter. He recalls individual voices rising from the laughter of the studio audience, the cackle of a St. Louis businessman, the brassy wail of a high-shouldered blonde just arrived in California, where women wear their hair this year in aromatic bales. Vollmer has entered a strange phase. He spends all his time at the window now, looking down at the earth. The view is endlessly fulfilling. It is like the answer to a lifetime of questions and vague cravings. It satisfies every childlike curiosity, every muted desire. Whatever there is in him of the scientist, the poet, the primitive seer, the watcher of fire and shooting stars, whatever obsessions eat at the night side of his mind, whatever sweet and dreamy yearning he has ever felt for nameless places far away, whatever earth sense he possesses, the neural pulse of some wilder awareness, a sympathy for beasts, whatever belief in an immanent vital force, the Lord of creation, whatever secret harboring of the idea of human oneness, whatever wishfulness and simple-hearted hope, whatever of too much and not enough, all at once and little by little, whatever burning urge to escape responsibility and routine, escape his own over-specialization, the circumscribed and inward spiraling self, whatever remnants of his boyish longing to fly, his dream of strange spaces and eerie heights, his fantasies of happy death, whatever indolent and sybaritic leanings, lotus eater, smoker of grasses and herbs, blue-eyed gazer into space, all these are satisfied, all collected and massed in that living body, the sight he sees from the window. It is just so interesting, he says at last, the colors and all. The colors and all. Thank you. Okay.
We didn't strategize. Thank you all for coming tonight. There is no living American writer who's meant more to me over my years as a writer than Don, so it's an honor to be on the stage with you. I wrote down a few questions.
They're awfully long.
There's one longish one. I'm just going to just tuck right into the questions, and we'll see how this goes. When did you start writing stories? Was there a period of apprenticeship before Americana when you were doing short things?
Yes, I did only short stories for quite a spell, and only intermittently. I hadn't yet become what I would call a writer. I was skipping along, so to speak, and I published 2 or 3 of these stories to my enormous surprise. I remember the first short story I published.
What was it called?
I think it was called The River Jordan, or maybe that was the second one. I think it was The River Jordan.
I didn't notice that one in this book.
No, a number of stories are not in the book. The book consists of what I and my editor, Nan Graham, think of as the best stories. And they range from 1979 to last year. Before that, yes, there were other stories. And maybe we'll do another very obscure publication 22 years after I die. But in the meantime, I published a story in Epoch magazine. I think it was The River Jordan. And the minute I got the remarkable letter from the editor of the publication, whose name I remember because it's so different from my own name, it's Baxter Hathaway. And I was stunned. I think I was 22 or 23 years old at the time. I was stunned. And the second thought was that I wanted to write back to him and say, please, I was only kidding, I can do better. That's how it started.
Were you thinking of novels all along? Was that ambition on the horizon?
I think it was on the far horizon. Yeah. I was thinking of novels, but very distantly. And it took me quite a long time to finally start a novel. And I worked on it for 2 years before I could convince myself that I was a writer.
Right.
And then I worked on it for another 2 years, and then I guess I was a writer.
And suddenly then it was novels, and a lot of novels.
Yes.
Pretty quickly.
Yes.
Through the 70s into the 80s. So the stories became more interstitial.
Right.
And it's a beautiful book, by the way, and it's really it has a different feel than anything you've done. It's a happy book. There's something happy about bringing those stories together, I have to say. But as I was reading them, it was tempting. Even listening to you now, I was thinking, well, Running Dog might have been from around this time, and there's actually a human moment in World War II that book culminates in. Yeah. Certainly the title story seemed like it felt of the time of underworld, the starveling, hard not to connect with the same spirit as Point Omega. Is there some way in which this? How do the stories relate to the novels?
It's very hard for me to relate them. I never think I never think of the stories and the novels as a combined force. A story seems just so independent and so isolated from anything else. I have trouble thinking of the stories as a single integral unit, although once they were published, it began to occur to me that I think practically all of these stories involve 2 or 3 individuals in conflict. Of course, we could say that about almost anything that anybody writes.
Yeah.
But what the hell?
There you have it. Try it at home. 2 or 3 individuals in conflict. Quoting from Midnight in Dostoevsky, which feels like a story about a young writer, I have to say. It feels like a story of apprenticeship itself. Here's the quote. At times abandon meaning to impulse. Let the words be the facts. This was the nature of our walks, to register what was out there, all the scattered rhythms of circumstances and occurrence, and to reconstruct it as human noise. How important is meaning to your writing?
Being there?
Meaning.
It is not the primary force at all. I think of myself as a writer of sentences, and I will always follow language, and will sometimes yield meaning to words, just to words, to the sound of words, to the look of words, and to the beauty at times of a phrase or a sentence or a paragraph, or what I hope is an element of beauty. And which seems, I guess, a strange thing for a novelist to say as opposed to a poet, but it's the way I feel. I've always felt that way. And I don't know where meaning comes from. It builds gradually as I work on a piece of work, on a novel in particular. It happens slowly, and I could say that The Body Artist is a novel of time and loss, but I never set out to write a novel of time and loss. I just set out to deal with these characters and the language that develops from these characters.
And where do the characters come from? If you are starting from character, can you account for how you select this couple in the woods, feeling haunted in a house? I mean, is it the concept? What are you? Who are the characters? Is it a voice? Is it
in that
image?
novel, in The Body Artist?
Yeah.
I started with one thing very clearly, actually 2 things. The first thing was the question: how do people who have an intimate relationship, how do they talk to each other when they're alone? And I thought, well, a scene between 2 such people at breakfast. And that's what started this novel. They speak in half phrases, half sentences, meaningless imprecations, all sorts of oddnesses that they may or may not understand as the conversation goes on. That's all that I knew. And the only other thing I knew was that I wanted to write something about 2 people living in a large house, which also contains also contains a third person unknown to the 2. And these 2 elements, these 2 ideas combined to form the basis of The Body Artist.
Mr. Pincus? No, what was his name?
Mr. Tuttle.
Mr. Tuttle, that's right.
It was Pincus, but I changed it.
There you go. First thought, best thought. Okay, here's my long question. It's not that long. A late line in The Ivory Acrobat. This is a sentence that has meaning, I think, by the way. Mm-hmm. Her self-awareness ended where the acrobat began. If you haven't read the story, you'll see why that's a great thing for the story to come to. I'm struck by how, like a religious relic, the Ivory Acrobat comes to be, it's Minoan, not Catholic. But I have the sense that what you accomplish with language in the fiction, the way language foregrounds itself, even sometimes abandoning meaning to impulse, as the kid says or thinks, it's constantly serving to confront the reader with the mystery of language, with the unknowability of existence in a way that feels sort of Catholic. See, your language stands outside reality. It is what it is. And when I tie that in with how so many of your novels and stories seem like meditations on death, they're very death-haunted books, almost all of them. Well, that combination of mystery and preoccupation with death, it makes me wonder, do you see yourself as a mystical writer? Do you understand where the question's coming from?
Yeah.
I do, I guess.
Yeah. No,
Is that a concept for you?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you said. I do think my background has, to some extent, formed the way I think and write, and I do think there's a mystical element in my work in general, and I guess in some work more than others. In the story you refer to, it's set in Greece and Athens, and so as you said, the relic, the holy relic, becomes a Minoan object, to change the subject a little, I lived in Athens for a time with my wife, and there was an earthquake, as in the story, and much of what happened is based on personal experience, although not our personal experience, but that actually of a friend of ours who was very stricken by the earthquake, and a lot of people went to church immediately afterward, and there seemed to be a hovering sense of in some kind of inevitable act, it's an odd story. What's the title of that story?
It is The Ivory Acrobat.
The Ivory Acrobat, and that's the name of the actual Minoan object.
Yeah.
The Ivory Acrobat. In part, I wrote this story because I love that phrase. Believe it or not, the Ivory Acrobat. I said, this is beautiful, and I wanted to write something.
That's so foiling of the interviewer. But it's exactly what I would think you would say, because it is a beautiful phrase. It's the woman in that story is, the earthquake's happening, and she is basically trying with her awareness to get at it, and it just recedes. And what you have in its place as a reader are the words that are, and then you cling to the words as you're reading the story, and there's that. This is. I don't think there's another writer I have this, and certainly not another prose writer I have this experience with. You read the sentence, and there seems to be something almost like between the L's. Like, if only I could get between those L's, I would get it. I would have the thing. There's an imminence there, but I don't. But of course, they're just ink marks on a page.
Well, I don't think about that myself, but I'm glad to hear that this is your response, because no, it's true, because I do think that ultimately, even though I'm not aiming at it, I think that's what I do. It's simply what I do intuitively. Yes.
Yeah. Going on to Baader Meinhof and the Starveling, and also Point Omega, I'm struck by how creepy and full of potential harm, transgression, your art galleries and movie theaters are. like you read those things and you think twice about setting foot in a otherwise deserted gallery space or a movie theater in the middle of the day. What's that about? I mean, why do those spaces have that effect?
I don't know. I think in the story Baader Meinhof, which many of you know refers to the paintings by Gerhard Richter of the Baader Meinhof gang of terrorists in Germany in the 1970s. And he painted from photographs. And the paintings are quite obscure and sort of cloudy of the individuals, some of them dead, of the terrorists, some of them dead. And it seemed to me, it seemed something I had to try to understand a little better. And I don't know whether writing the story helped me do that, because much art remains just outside our comprehension or our verbal analysis. And that's one of the reasons I like to look at art. I don't have to write about it in a critical sense. And normally I don't have to talk about it, although here I am in public.
I have one torment after another here for you.
So I just placed the character in the gallery, and of course, because the paintings themselves are filled with a sense of danger, I ended up with two characters and an element of almost ordinary, everyday danger, with more or less two ordinary people, a man and a woman.
It's really creepy.
Yeah.
In a good way.
Well, yeah, the male character is a creepy fellow.
Just going back to the secondary or second place status of meaning as you're writing a novel. It may come later, it may arise later. Was that always the case, or was there some? I'm just curious about these early stories, which I'm sure I could look up. Was there ever a time when you were, you were turning to more conventional questions? How to live? How should society be organized? Political, moral?
You mean aside from my writing?
Yeah. No. Well, in terms of what's engendering the fiction. Was there a conscious decision? I'm not going to, that's not my thing.
I lived in one room for quite a long time in the middle of Manhattan, about a 3.5-minute walk from this library, and I used to tell people that the Queens Midtown Tunnel emptied out into my street, and I used to tell people I live in the Queens Midtown Tunnel. And it felt that way in a curious manner. In other words, I was hidden. I felt hidden. But I had a life. I had friends, and I had movies to go to. And eventually, when I started my novel, the first novel, that's what I did. I didn't have the romantic feeling of being a young writer in Paris in the 1920s. This was the Queens Midtown Tunnel that I was writing in, but it was great. I was lucky. I had no responsibility at that time, and I was paying very little rent. I wasn't earning any money, but I wasn't spending very much at all. And I was a happy writer. If I never thought of it in those terms, but I did what I wanted to do. It's simple as that.
And that first novel really feels like it came out of a social scene. I mean, it's a bunch of guys in a car, basically. Americana. I'm thinking.
A bunch of guys in a car.
Yeah. relating like people who. It's more. I mean, that's not all it is, but there's a road trip. There's sort of a complex little social knot of people who seem to have been drinking together.
Yeah.
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 Okay. One last story really bears mentioning, I think, which is the title story. Which has a particular lush fullness, I think. In the other stories, the characters seem more like individuals who are embodying the loneliness of a crowd. They are, even when they have names, we're finding them at points in their lives where they're drifting, or their lives have become very, very minimal. They're living in the Queens Midtown Tunnel, as it were, and are sort of transparent to the world. But Sister Edgar, who's the key nun, the main nun in Sister Esmeralda, she's so purposeful, so purpose-driven, and so specific. I have to ask the kind of question that I hate to be asked, which is, was there a Sister Edgar in your own life? Were you thinking of a particular person?
Yes.
Okay.
And it goes back to a Catholic grammar school. The nuns were very strict. Well, not all of them, but a fair number. And I think it's what we needed, kids growing up in the Bronx, in many cases, with parents who were immigrants or grandparents who were immigrants. And we learned basic things. We learned grammar, we learned vocabulary, we learned how to memorize. And the story, the main character, Sister Edgar, this is the Angel Esmeralda, which I wrote and published in Esquire, and then figured out how it might also be used in the novel Underworld in a different manner. But it's different from the other stories, as you indicated. It's a very sad tale of the South Bronx, I think in roughly the 1970s, when the Bronx, as the saying goes, was burning. There was no law, there was no fire department. And here are two nuns, Sister Edgar and Sister Grace, very different individuals, trying to find a wild child, Esmeralda, who lives somewhere in the rubble of a huge empty neighborhood. And they aren't able to find her in time. And it's something that seemed implied in that period of time, in that part of New York City.
Yes.
And that's what got me started.
But the affection you seem to have for Sister Edgar, actually both, the nuns they're incredibly lovable. It's Gracie and Edgar, right? And did you like the nuns as a kid?
I respected them, and I liked some of them, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And Sister Edgar, to give you an idea of how this story leaps into another dimension, in Underworld, the novel, Sister Edgar becomes a counterpart, a sort of mystical counterpart of J. Edgar Hoover. None of this is in the story at all. She becomes transcendent in the much longer space of the novel.
So how did the composition of the story relate to the composition of Underworld?
The story was written as a unit, but in Underworld,
before or during?
Yeah. Before Underworld.
Before Underworld.
But then I chopped it into 2 parts for the novel. I think two or more. I'm not sure.
I recognized in the story form one of the details that you and I talked about when Underworld was coming together, that every 30 seconds a jet landing at LaGuardia. And
Right.
And I said, I believe the FAA minimum is 1.5 minutes, and you came back to me having talked to the FAA, and they said, yes, that's absolutely true, except they make an exception at LaGuardia.
Did we
Yeah, we actually had that conversation. Yeah. Gives you it's never a pleasant experience landing at LaGuardia, and then you realize that exceptions are made like that. Moving out into a few broader questions. For me, your language is so substantial in a way that verges on that kind of religious substance. I have a very hard time personally imagining reading it in ebook form. And I'm wondering then, from your side as the producer of such substantial language, how important the physical book is to you.
Oh, it's very important to me, yes. And
Tell me more about that.
Well,
articulate it better than I've been able to, please.
I couldn't do that, but I will make an attempt. Paper, it's paper, and it's what we've been using for centuries. And for me, at the very outset, it was enormously satisfying to find something that I'd written in a book. Here it was in 3 dimensions, something you could slip on a bookshelf, or something that the library would have on a shelf. And I'm sure you've looked at the books on your shelf at times, and I know that I feel quite a strong sense of satisfaction, of emotional satisfaction, looking at books that I've owned for so many years. I have paperbacks that cost 35 cents, or at most 95 cents, and then some hardcover books that I bought secondhand for $1. The trilogy, the Studs-Lonigan trilogy, about a young boy in Chicago who grows to manhood within 3 novels. I bought this in hardcover, Modern Library, $1. And the $1 mark in pencil is still in the book.
Sure.
And it's part of who you are, particularly if as you get to a certain age, to own these books. And it seems inconceivable to me that anyone could feel that way about electronic versions of books.
Have you tried reading an ebook?
Only in ads for ebooks in a newspaper.
The screen resolution is lower in the newspaper picture of the... Leaving aside that recent technological changes in the book industry, can you talk a little bit about how the world of American fiction looked to you when you were living in the Queens Midtown Tunnel and starting to work on Americana, and maybe how it compares to what the world looks like to you today? I mean, you're sort of at the top of the world today, so that's obviously a change. But I'm curious, I mean, you came up some years before I did, and I remember so vividly what the major fixtures of that world were, and so many of those are missing now. I'm wondering what the fixtures of, it was a world you were trying to enter in some way, however haltingly, you were trying to enter the world of American fiction. Curious how it looked from the outside and at the very beginning from the inside when you first got inside it.
Well, and then I think I'll answer with a personal story. When I was around 25 years old or 26 years old, I spent some time in a part of Fire Island, you know, that 40-mile strip of existentialism just below the south shore of Long Island. And sharing a house with about 12 other young men and women. And I'd heard that Nelson Algren was living for that summer on the island. And Algren was a writer I admired, known as a Chicago writer, but he transcended that. And a sort of tough guy, as he seemed, the man with the golden arm, and other very impressive books. And so the day after I heard that Algren was there, I saw him, and we became buddies. We became beach buddies. And from him, I learned that the writer's life could be quite difficult. And he was aggrieved for any number of reasons about the way he'd been treated as a writer, and as a writer whose most famous novel, The Man with the Golden Arm, had been made into a movie by Otto Preminger. And I guess Algren felt literally shortchanged on the financial end. But we had wonderful conversations. He was very kind and read my short stories and commented on them, and would ultimately review my first novel.
Wow.
So this was the writer, this was a real writer, and it meant a lot to me that he was receptive to not only to reading what I wrote, but just to spending time with me. We played poker with two gorgeous young women, and what could be better than that?
Getting paid properly for the man with the golden arm.
It was a mock poker game. I ended up winning $176,000. That's my introduction in 3 dimensions to the writer's life, and it was a fortunate one for me.
Personal story of my own. One of the first times you and I went out, many years ago now, some guy was handing out flyers on a street corner, and you took one and said...
I'm amazed that you remember that.
Because...
I took the street flyer because Nelson Algren told me that every time you take a flyer from someone standing on the street, it means he goes home that much sooner. And
ever since then, I've religiously taken flyers. I'll tap them on the arm if they don't see me to make sure they give me a flyer.
That's good, because I've stopped taking them.
They say that people get more conservative as they get older. You are yourself a big moviegoer. You've recently seen and you've recently seen Cosmopolis go from book to film. Can you talk about the differences for you between the experiences of watching a movie and reading a book as experiences? Or you can talk about Cosmopolis if you'd rather.
Well, I'll just say briefly that David Cronenberg, who directed the film, did very impressive work. And I've never seen a movie with such interesting dialogue. Unlike almost any movie I've ever seen, because what does dialogue do in a movie? It just gives us an idea of who a character is and and what the plot is doing. But in this case, dialogue doesn't always have a purpose. It's just people speaking dialogue. Beyond that, movies in general meant a lot to me when I was a younger man, particularly European movies which hit this country in the 1960s, early 60s. And it gave me the idea that a film could have the depth and range of a novel, which had never occurred to me. And I'm not aware that movies directly influence the way I write, but I do know that I took enormous pleasure, and I guess there's an element of movies or photography or art in a great many things I've written.
The movie pulls you along. You don't have to turn the pages. Even if it's a boring movie, it's still over in 2 hours and
Exactly.
45 minutes.
Exactly.
Whereas the book, you can't drift through in the same way.
Yeah.
You came to books before. If your feeling when you saw those European films was, oh, this is as rich as a novel can be, you presumably had the experience of the richness of the novel before that.
Oh, yeah, sure. Absolutely.
So what were some of the first books you remember having that admiring feeling about?
Well, I guess one of the first books was, as I mentioned earlier, the Studs Lonergan trilogy. And then, of course, Hemingway and Faulkner were major pleasures. Not necessarily influences at all, but great pleasures. And I think transcending all of this, there was James Joyce and Ulysses. I read it twice in just a few years. And what I remember most are not the pyrotechnics or the merging themes, but the beauty of the language as Joyce used it, particularly in the first few chapters of Ulysses. I mean, I actually remember sitting in that room in the Midtown Tunnel and reading those chapters and the strong effect it had on me. Here it was, the beauty of language, and I was able to appreciate it, to feel it.
I know what you mean, because each time I try to read the whole thing, the parts I read are those chapters.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's very hard to imagine you writing journalism.
Journalism?
Yeah, you seem more like the shaman, the person that people come to, not the person who goes to people with a notebook in your hand. But you do enjoy reading good journalism. I think we've talked about that David Gran piece on Guatemala in the New Yorker a couple of years ago.
Yes.
Did you ever consider doing it yourself? I'm sure at various points Esquire must have said, oh, go to the political convention.
Yes, I've been asked, but no, I haven't done it. I just don't think I'd be good at it. It's simple as that.
Why not?
Well, it's hard to explain. I don't have the desire particularly. And I've done reporting within the context of a novel, but of course I'm reporting just for my own benefit.
Right.
And I
With a notebook in hand, an actual notebook?
I take notes all the time.
Uh-huh.
It has nothing to do with reporting. I mean, on the subway, I'll think of something that relates to what I'm writing at the time, and I'll jot it down so I don't forget it. This happens quite frequently. I mean, I have stacks of notes connected to the novel I'm engaged in now, and more notes than I think I've ever compiled for a novel. It's all notes.
Welcome to my world.
Yes?
Oh yeah, the notes. The notes are like 3 times the length of the book at least, and they're unreadable too.
In many cases.
Yes.
Oh, and when you can
Oh my
read
God! Oh my God!
Yeah.
There is nothing more boring than reading those notes.
when you can read them, you don't know what the hell they mean.
If this were a debate, this would be the moment we'd be asked, or you'd be asked, if you'd like to make a final address to the assembled town hall. If you don't, we can actually open it up to town hall questions.
Let's ask for questions.
Let's ask for questions. Reserving the right to make summary statements. I think it's actually my job to call on people. Oh, okay. It's not my job. It's whoever gets to the microphone first.
Hi there. I guess about 20 years ago, you published Mao Tzu, and the protagonist was a writer, and more or less came to the conclusion that terrorism the terrorist act had replaced the act of writing as a kind of the vital act of communication. And I wondered if you would continue writing. Of course, you did, and I just wondered, what is your personal relationship to that character's choices?
It's the character is
He's a comic character.
He's got nothing to do with me. He's purely no, it's true. He's purely a fictional character, and the fact is he's a writer. But I would not have said the things that this man Bill Gray says in the novel. Not at all. I don't know that I could relate terrorism and fiction in any meaningful way. I thought that in the context of the book and in the context of this character's life, these were things that were worth exploring.
Is that really true? I mean,
yeah.
You're reminding me of Stephen Malkmus when he was asked about a lyric in the one song of his where the lyrics made sense, where he's singing, it's a career, and he, in an interview, said, no, I was saying, it's Korea. I was...
No, it's absolutely true. I would not create a character who was a counterpart of me. Most particularly a writer.
But in defense of the gentleman's question,
yeah.
That's not the only book. I mean, you had your eye on terrorism as...
Oh yes, I did.
As the big pen writing on the page of history for 30 years. It goes back to the it's already nascent in the names.
Yeah.
It's not just Mao Tzu.
That's another element. I mean, I don't compare terrorists with novelists. It's simple as that.
That's a good point.
You might be my favorite writer. Thanks for coming.
Well, thank you.
I've always loved the descriptions in your books of real-world pieces of visual art. I was wondering if you've had any nice experiences, any striking experiences with pieces of visual art recently.
Yes, it happens all the time, and I mean, what immediately comes to mind is Jackson Pollock. When I first came across his work at the Museum of Modern Art, and it was a revelation to me. I didn't know what to say about it, and I still don't, honestly. But the sense of pattern, the sense of design, the sense that that I could not bring any kind of verbal comprehension to this. This is in part what drew me to it. I mean, I do like figurative painting also, of course, but this was special, and Mark Rothko as well. And it happens all the time in museums and galleries everywhere. I just, the design is just so satisfying at times of particular paintings or different kinds of works of art that I feel lucky to be standing there looking at this canvas.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here. It's a great night.
Thank you.
So much in our culture seems so fluid right now, particularly in the art world, literature, music, film. What's the future of the novel as you see it, both of you? And is it going to stay the same? Has it changed? And are you paying attention to any younger writers that you feel perhaps are starting to carve that out? And not necessarily has to be a younger writer. Could be you, or you.
Sure. Well, that's the future of the novel, right here on my left, and of course others. American. Here's what I think. I think that young, talented men and women are still drawn to the novel more, perhaps, than to any other form. I mean, it's still part of our intellectual. It's an intellectual inbreeding in a curious way. People want to write fiction, and what will happen to American fiction is very hard for me to say, because I think it becomes complicated due to the fact that computerology will become part of fiction, and I would like to know what Jonathan thinks of this, if you don't mind.
Computer, what was the phrase?
Well, I said computerology.
Computerology. That's such a homely word. Let's hope it never becomes part of the novel. Well, I would say actually just, I've read a lot. People send manuscripts and galleys to me, and I take a look at them. I have for many years now, and because people read my stuff when I was starting out, and it seems like you pay back, and also because I'm curious, and because I'm desperately concerned that the novel continue to be strong in this country and elsewhere. And yet it's oppressive to have a stack of these things. And so I'm looking always to get rid of them quickly. And I read until I come to something, a sentence so bad that it just, like, there's no way I'm going to read the whole book, because you can't. And what I'm wanting to say is that unexpectedly, in the last 2 or 3 years, it has been harder to get rid. Either I've become much softer and more tolerant of bad sentences, but I don't think that's it. It seems to me that there's an incredible number of very, very well-written books coming through right now. Or maybe I'm just getting sent better books, I don't know. But so I agree. Kind of miraculously, the form is continuing to attract really talented men and women, and what the future holds. My line is the kind of novels I care about, they were never read by 99% or 75% or 40% or even 30% of the population. It was always we were a minority. We were the birds of the world, kind of getting driven aside by everything else. And that in fact, the value of fiction that is sustaining increases as the need for a refuge from the noise increases. So I'm actually optimistic, and I think that in the same way that you see, perhaps annoyingly, some here and there. You see a move toward locally grown produce. In response to the mechanization, the industrialization of American farming, I think a certain thing may very well happen with respect to the mechanization of everyday life. That there will be perversely an increased attraction to the traditional form. It's not broken; the form is still working.
Thank you both so much for being here. I've heard that, I've read in interviews with you that you do very little planning or outlining when beginning a novel. But certain novels, and I'm thinking mostly, or particularly of Underworld here, have a very intricate structure. And so I wonder, when in the process of this book that you're sort of writing one sentence at a time, those larger structures kind of begin to take hold?
It's a very good question, and it seems to be different from book to book. And it does happen very gradually. At some point in the course of a novel, I'll realize that a structure is beginning to manifest itself. In the novel Point Omega, the structure is quite obvious. It's like...
I was sort of sucker punched by it. It wasn't obvious until the end.
It
wasn't obvious to me until the end.
Well, that's okay. I mean, of course. No. There's a symmetry. I mean, there's a symmetry, and you don't know there's a symmetry until you get to the end, of course. But
in spite of the big omega on the cover.
it's. I mean, probably more than any of my novels. It's like a tripartite canvas, and there's a dark edge and another dark edge with a very bright middle. See, that's the structure. But I didn't know this until, I don't know, at a certain point I began to understand that this was going to be a novel that that was a kind of architecture to it, more so than in most cases.
Yeah, no, I would say it's your most formally stringent book. Yeah. And it got a raw deal, I think, in terms of some of the reception. I love that book.
Thank you.
We'll take a few more, but are you okay? One more? Okay, one more.
You just want to return to this topic of notes, which you both mentioned.
Yeah.
Could you discuss possibly, quickly, both of you, how you would return back to a manuscript and synthesize those notes without feeling like you're jamming them in, or maybe just discuss a little bit of the process of how you return to a note when you're working on a larger work without it being too much, too jarring to the overall work?
It's something that seems to happen very naturally, so naturally that it's hard to describe. There are notes that I just get rid of because at a certain point they don't work. They don't work in this novel or in this story. I don't need them. So I put them aside, and they go into an archive in Texas. Or everything else seems to be an element of intuition that I know that this note, these 6 lines that I've written, which are not 6 lines of text. They're just some sort of scrawl about what a character might do or say. I know that this is going to work, and I know when I'm going to use it. And I may sense that I'm not going to use it until another 58 pages or so. And so I just put it in a certain slot in a pad like this. And when I get to that part of the novel, I will excavate the note, extravate the note, extricate the note.
Exhume the note. Extract. Okay.
You have to answer now.
Okay, I have to answer. Well, there's sort of 2 notes are two kinds of notes. The kind I think more like you were asking about would be the ones that I wake up anxious at 4 in the morning, feeling that my work is terrible, and some particular problem I'm having has proved that it will always be terrible, and but I'll wake up suddenly seeing something. I'll write it down by the bedside, and that's no problem fitting it in because it directly addresses what the problem was the day before. So, and the rest of the notes, the million words of notes, those are mostly kind of self-analysis sessions. It's cheaper than paying a therapist to listen to me talk in circles. I can just talk in circles to myself in the notes. But occasionally, when I'm really trying to get something going, the notes will actually turn into the prose.
Right.
And then you see in the stack afterwards, there were no more entries for the next 3 weeks because actually I was writing. And so really the notes are what you do, what I do when I'm not able to write for whatever reason, but I don't want to face myself at the end of the day having absolutely done nothing. So instead what I have done is I've written 1,200, 1,500 words of notes that I may never be able to look at again, but I have written something that day. And in fact, it's bread and water. That's all it is, and it's just crumbs. But it staves off that feeling of utter worthlessness that one is so prone to at the end of a day when nothing has been accomplished.
There's worthlessness and there's utter worthlessness.
Yeah, utter worthlessness, exactly. You've been a lovely audience.
I think I speak for everyone. We're very grateful. Jonathan Franzen, Don DeLillo.